but I have been working with Jordan pretty much every day for the last 4 years. So I was there when he came up with the idea for this project and kind of helped him with smoothing the way through the whole implementation and understanding of what was going on out there in Alberta. So the title is The Population State-Dependent Invasion Potential of Mountain Pine Beetle in Alberta, which is kind of a mouthful, but really what we're talking about is that mountain pine beetle is an eruptive species, and when it's during an outbreak, during an epidemic, it has distinctive behaviors and occupies a distinct niche, whereas most of the time it is not, an outbreak is not happening. Outbreaks are temporary, and when it's not during an outbreak, it exists as an endemic phase population, and they have distinct behaviors, they occupy a distinct niche. So the idea is that in these different population states, mountain pine beetle may or may not have particular advantages in these Alberta pine forests. So just to get started, mountain pine beetle is undergoing this outbreak range expansion. You can see it's pushed all the way far up to the north, I guess into the Yukon now, and it's being detected closer and closer to the Saskatchewan border. So there's this risk of a boreal invasion. So there's this question about the host shift to jack pine. Is it happening? How successful are they being? What's the timeline for spread through the boreal to more productive regions in Ontario? And yeah, so that's the scenario. And when you think about mountain pine beetle as an invasive species, we've only seen it as an epidemic in Alberta. And we've seen that as an epidemic, it is very successful. So the invasion potential is very high. It's obviously been very successful. There's evidence of higher reproduction in these novel pines, which Nadir alluded to. And also from some data in our lab is evidence that outbreaks are more severe and they're lasting quite a bit longer. So this is data from another master's student in our lab, Anthony Robinson. And as you can see, the percentage mortality in these novel pine stands is higher, and they're lasting several years longer in these stands as compared to the native range, where you don't see as high mortality and it's ending quite early. So mountain pine beetle, it has an advantage in these novel habitats. And Jordan explored the reasons why they're being so successful in these novel habitats. And the idea is that it has to do with weak defenses, and these weak defenses arise from a lack of coevolution. So, as was alluded to earlier, the pine has recolonized since the glaciation retreat, and the beetles followed up as far north as they could, but then due to climate, the beetles stopped short, so they weren't occupying the northern ranges of pine. And so these pine populations that were climatically shielded for a long time lost this ability to defend themselves because they weren't experiencing beetle mortality as a selection pressure. So as you move from the native range out into these novel pine habitats, there's less evolutionary history, and beetles perform better, so their invasion potential is higher. Which brings us to this idea of the invasion potential in the boreal forest. We have signs of successful mass attack. All the chemical ecology is there. We know they can mass attack. We know they can reproduce and spread. And they're there, and there's that giant corridor that connects all the way to the East Coast. So what's happening? Jack pine have all these traits that suggest elevated susceptibility. They don't have the defensive capacity. They have higher concentrations of alpha-pinene, which is this pheromone precursor, so they may be more apparent to foraging beetles on the landscape. So with all this evidence piling up, it seems that individual jack pine trees are even more susceptible than these novel lodgepole pine populations. So we have this scenario where they've successfully invaded novel lodgepole pine. They're right on the doorstep of jack pine. Most of the evidence is indicating that jack pine is even more susceptible than the novel lodgepole situation, but very few, if any, mass attacks in jack pine are being detected. Sure, there have been several, and it's been shown in the lab that they're highly successful, but in terms of sustained outbreaks, there's not very many in jack pine. There's a few right at the edge of the hybrid zone, like around Slave Lake, Athabasca, the town of Athabasca region, but other than that, they haven't really gotten much further. So the question is, are we wrong? Like, what's happening here? And the lack of epidemic mountain pine beetle in jack pine is probably due to a combination of things. Like, first of all, as Alan showed, the control efforts have been monumental, and they're actually slowing the rate of spread, and they're ultimately reducing the number of beetles that are arriving in these jack pine stands. There's not enough to really kind of set off this kind of epidemic behavior. And then second of all, there's kind of some marginal climatic suitability going on. There's cold winters, unseasonable cold snaps, long hot summers that may be interfering with beetle development and emergence. That's still, it's not fully understood how they're adapting to this climate. And then third is this low jack pine volume and density. So you can kind of see on this map, the density and the darkness of the shades of green show how much pine volume there is. Once you get out into eastern Alberta, where jack pine starts to dominate, there's really low density. And so that seems to be a big factor in why there's not the rate of spread has slowed. There's just not enough connected high volume forest for them to take up residence in. And so the real question going forward is what happens out there? Is this a temporary lull before they start to move east rapidly again? Will there be some kind of collapse? And if there's a collapse, will there be persistence? Will there be kind of low density populations kicking around out there that could slowly spread east and percolate through these kind of stands that are less susceptible to epidemic outbreaks? So to really understand this, we've got to take a quick look at mountain pine beetle population dynamics. Really, I just want to reiterate that mountain pine beetle normally exists in the endemic states, where it behaves like a secondary bark beetle. It's got low population densities, it can't mass attack, and needs to seek out trees that have compromised defenses, because they're not going to be able to mass attack at all. And as a consequence of seeking out defensively compromised trees, they're competing with the other subcortical insects in those stands. So whatever resident insects are there, that's who they have to compete with for food. And then as their populations increase over time, they start to escape from the defenses of the trees and escape from this competition with the other insects, and they start to mass attack. And so that's what is kind of shown in this complicated diagram, is that below a certain population density, you're going to see endemic behavior and occupation of the endemic niche. Once you pass a critical threshold, you get epidemic behavior, and they're off to the races. And once they're in an epidemic, they're going to continue until they deplete the host resources. But eventually, at some point, the epidemic is going to collapse. And if they're going to be a persistent issue in a landscape, they need to be able to collapse into this endemic phase, survive, persist for multiple generations while the forest regenerates in order to re-erupt again. So as far as the invasion potential of the epidemic state in jack pine, there's kind of conflicting lines of evidence. Jack pine individuals seem to be much more susceptible, but this kind of mixed wood, low density pine landscape seems to be less susceptible. As far as invasion potential of the endemic phase, we know that there's a lot more constraints on endemic phase populations because they're so small and they're so incapable of mass attack. So things like competition and resource availability become much more important to endemic phase populations, and constraints in jack pine were not very well understood. According to the Safraniuk et al. 2010 risk assessment, the idea was that there's not really many major biotic barriers to the persistence and spread of endemic mountain pine beetles in jack pine. And we know that mountain pine beetles are well adapted in lodgepole pine to endemic persistence. They emerge at a certain time that allows them to access trees that are under water stress. Most of their competitors fly earlier in the season, but because there's so much resource available in these forests, there's enough to go around. They don't suffer from competition. So part of my research was going out and investigating the endemic niche available to mountain pine beetle in jack pine. And what we really found is it's a density equation. So when you have a dense lodgepole pine forest, a closed canopy system, you get inter-tree competition. Trees are competing for light and space and nutrients. And as a consequence, they start to drop out of the system. Trees die because their neighbors shade them out. And that forms like a constant source of food for for endemic beetles and other bark beetle species. Whereas jack pine, you kind of get these open woodland scenarios, there's less tree competition, and as a result you get less resource availability, less of these dying trees that are incapable of defense. And so associated with that is a drastic change in the competitive assemblage. So really in lodgepole pine, endemic mountain pine beetle primarily competes with other secondary bark beetles, Whereas in jack pine, we were finding that these trees susceptible to an endemic mountain pine beetle are occupied by wood borers, and they're bringing in antagonistic fungi with them. So the competition scenario is much, much different in jack pine for an endemic mountain pine beetle. So then, so really what we're finding out there is wood borers, so Cerambycidae and Buprestidae, are colonizing lots of the phloem that would normally be colonized by bark beetles. And they're bringing with them Ophiostoma minus, which is a ubiquitous saprosylic blue stain type fungus, which is really closely related to the mountain pine beetle's symbiotic fungi, but it does not have that same role. In the southern pine beetle system, which is very similar, Ophiostoma minus is everywhere, and it's actually has a negative effect on beetle reproduction. So the competition in a lodgepole pine scenario, they're dealing with secondary bark beetles. There's not a whole lot of Ophiostoma minus. In jack pine, they're dealing with wood borers all the time, and they seem to be associated with this other antagonistic black stain disease. So the organizing research question that Jordan was trying to get at is that given the mountain pine beetles in these novel habitats, and in order to be a long-term threat and in order to spread naturally through these kind of low-density systems, they need to be able to persist as a endemic phase population. So given these potential changes in trophic interactions, what is the likelihood of mountain pine beetle persistence in novel pine habitats in Alberta, particularly jack pine versus lodgepole pine? So we set up an experiment to test this hypothesis that, there was this observation that wood borers were highly prevalent in these systems, and we wanted to experimentally test whether or not we could recreate that. So by adding a resource to a jack pine forest versus a lodgepole pine forest, what happens to that resource? We created defensively compromised resources, or he did, by girdling trees with a chainsaw. So he would go to the lower bowl of the tree, girdle it with a chainsaw, effectively separating the crown from the roots, and these trees began to die. And when you created this resource, you wanted to test predictions about whether or not wood borers and Ophiostoma minus would be more prevalent in dying jack pine trees compared to lodgepole pine trees. He wanted to look at their prevalence in a time series, so how early in the mortality process do you start to see wood borers attacking these trees? And then this prediction that wood borers are vectoring Ophiostoma minus. So do you see them occurring separately, or do they always occur together? So he set up this big repeated trial. So we had 2 populations per species. So he had a population in the native range, and then in the foothills, those were the 2 lodgepole pine, and then in near Slave Lake and near Lac La Biche for the jack pine, they girdled the trees, or he girdled the trees, monitored the outside for ovipositional scars every 6 months, and then destructively sampled the trees at 18 months. So he scored these trees on a mortality index by how dead the tree looked from the outside, so looking at things like foliage color and foliage retention. So trees that were green were low on the mortality index, and trees that were totally red and had needles falling off were the highest on the mortality index. And then he also came up with a phloem consumption or competition index. So that ranged from here, where there's almost nothing consumed, to here, where everything has been consumed. And onto so we had this big repeated trial. He had all these trees girdled, and nature decided to rear its ugly head, and in some of his sites there were windstorms. So here's a picture of Jordan looking very, very happy with Mother Nature, and some of his girdled trees that were just kind of annihilated. So he didn't get the replication that he wanted, but he still got some very good usable data out of this experiment. So on to these predictions. So you can see that in terms of wood borer oviposition, there's a big difference between lodgepole and jack pine populations. And another interesting result is that there was no difference in within pine species. So the jack pine ones were statistically the same, and the lodgepole pine populations were statistically the same. But in terms of oviposition, we saw a lot more. He saw a lot more oviposition on the wood borer trees, and it was happening earlier on in the mortality process. So trees that were still having some green needles were accruing oviposition scars, whereas in lodgepole pine, it remained pretty low all the way throughout the mortality process. And then in terms of subcortical occupation by wood borers, it was the same pattern. So wood borers, so where you saw lots of oviposition, you saw lots of subcortical occupation, more competition and it's the same pattern. Whereas in jack pine, by the time the tree is dead, you're seeing lots and lots of occupation by wood borers, and lodgepole pine, almost not at all. And then the next test was to look at Ophiostoma minus and how that was mediated between the two pine species, and it was the same result. And ultimately, when he did a comparison, like a regression between the occupation by O minus and by wood borers, it was almost a perfect fit. So if you didn't have wood borers, you really didn't see a whole lot of Ophiostoma minus, and where you had lots of wood borer activity, you saw lots of staining by O minus. But there was some variation. So some of the other species seemed to be vectoring O minus at least some of the time. So in conclusion, there is the competitive paradigm for endemic beetles in novel habitats, or at least in jack pine, is completely different than in lodgepole pine. And there's no difference within jack pine or within lodgepole pine's populations, which suggests it's fairly robust as you would move east. So we would expect not much to change once you got into Saskatchewan or Manitoba. And wood borers are vectoring O minus in this system, and so are other secondary bark beetles. So it's not just an insect competing with another insect for phloem space, it's actually bringing an antagonistic fungus that might actually interfere with the whole microbiome of the mountain pine beetle in these trees. And I think that really speaks to the lowered invasion potential of endemic mountain pine beetle, at least in jack pine. And the opposite would be true for lodgepole pine, which seems to be fairly similar, like the expanded and native range lodgepole pine seem to be very similar. And the real question that Jordan wanted to propose at the end of this is, what is the proximate and ultimate cause of this wood borer activity asymmetry in Canadian pines? So much seems to be very similar between these systems, and we have this real disparity in wood borer activity. And so with that, he would like to acknowledge all the people that have helped him conduct this study. Thank you.